Okay, so with SQL Alchemy, you can see I have this code base. The first thing, we're using this Flask SQL Alchemy tool. There is also just a straight away SQL Alchemy tool. They're very, very similar. They're very similar. But this one's a little bit easier to use for us. We're going to be integrating this with Flask ultimately. And then I'm also just installing the Flask library, right, in our requirements.txt file. And the other thing you can see is we have a migrations folder and a create tables file that just creates a table called users, all right? And then we just insert some data into that. So I forget actually, I think the name of the database is called CRM. Oh yeah, Flask M. We'll talk about that later on. We haven't seen this file yet, but kind of weird, I guess. Let's go start here. Okay. This file is ultimately, we don't have to design it this way, but this is essentially where we can put I think we called this run.py previously. This will create our application and we can run it. All right. So creating our Flask application is what I mean, and then run it. This will be the file that we actually kick off. Okay. By default, I guess we can talk about it now. By default, if we call Flask run, you see this? It says failed to find a Flask application or factory in the module app. Use app name to specify one. So by default, Flask is going to look for an application. Remember we did this whole create app thing? And that returned a Flask application for us. Okay, so it's going to look for that by default in the app init file, it seems like, right? That's what it's saying. Can't find a Flask application in app, all right? Now we can change that default through the Flask env file. So let's see this. So I'm going to do export Flask app equals server.py, all right? And now let's call Flask run. And what it's doing now is it's actually trying to run, let me just comment this out. It's trying to run this server.py file. Let's import. We can just, we'll just do dev create app right here, just to stub it out. Let's see. Okay, now look at this. It looks like the same error message. It's actually a little different. This time it says failed to find a Flask application in the module server, right? So it is looking for it in this module. It's looking for a Flask application in this module server because in our .flaskenv we said, hey, this is where the Flask app is going to live, right? In server.py. So that's what this .flaskenv is it allows us to, it's basically just like a .m file, but we're just setting our Flask app server.py. We're setting this environmental variable equal to server.py, and then when we call something like Flask run, it will look for the application in this file. All right, right now, this returns none, and originally what we did was we said, okay, let's actually go to app and import this function create app. All right, so that's what we can do next, is actually get an application working, a Flask app. So that means we should go to this file, right? Because it's from app, import create app. That means from the app directory, which is from this init file. So let's go here. Okay. So a couple things you see here. One is we're going to use the SQL Alchemy. We're going to use this SQL Alchemy class, and this will be kind of like the representation or the connection to the database ultimately, almost similar to scicopg2 import the connection. All right. So to get this running, you want to instantiate, right? This is a class, so we're creating a new instance of this SQL Alchemy connector object, all right? And we're just assigning it to DB. And then in this create app, here we will need to create a new Flask application, all right? So this is going to create a new Flask application. We'll set it equal to app, and then we can do app.config. You see I wrote it here because I always forget the name. It's app.config. So we set on our Flask application a configuration key, this SQL Alchemy database URI. We're saying where's the database that we're connecting to? And we want to connect to this connection string. So what is this connection string saying? This is connecting to our database. So this is Postgres database, localhost on my computer at port 5432 where it runs by default, the CRM database. So let's just take a look at that. So if I do PSQL and then -c CRM, you can see that, you know, I have a CRM database. It has a users table on it, right? I got that because I ran this against my CRM database. If I do like select all from users, right, we have this database, and now we have that table. And then the next thing is, let's connect to the database that has the users table, and do that by first setting my app.config and then the SQL Alchemy database URI to this connection, right, to this address. Okay. Now we did our application about you know, this database that lives here, but we did not yet tell this connection thing, right? We did not tell the SQL Alchemy library about it. So the next thing we have to do is just db.init app, call this function, and pass through an instance of Flask. Okay? So this actually will connect SQL Alchemy to your database, because it does it a little indirectly, right? But the app knows about this address through this SQL Alchemy database URI, and now SQL Alchemy knows about this. If we so let's return app. Okay, this time I think if we call Flask run, you see this, it works. It says serving Flask app server.py. You know, there's no route setup or anything like that, but we're no longer getting an error message. If we forgot to do this line right here, where we set or we forgot to do this line, if we essentially forget to connect a database to my application and then connect that to this DB, it's going to tell, oh, I lied. I thought it would give us an error message telling us to do it, but it didn't. That was unfortunate. Let's do this. Hold on. Let's also import DB. So I'm just saying from server.py, import this DB object. All right. And it still doesn't break. Oh, well, I tried. Anyway, you have to do this. You have to connect the application. You have to connect the DB to this database by setting the app.config. All right. Okay, so now at this point, this library knows about our database. That's very nice. The next thing is we want to, like, the same pattern that we saw with our ORM, we're doing in SQL Alchemy. So that is, we want each table, in this case we have a users table, to line up to a model. And you can see this is pretty similar, all right? So what we have is we're setting a table name attribute. We have to use this for SQL Alchemy to see it. So we're setting this class attribute to the corresponding table, right? So that's the users. And then we're using this DB object to say, like, hey, set this ID equal to a column of type integer, primary key true, right? And this corresponds to this, all right? So primary key, here it's serial. I don't think SQL Alchemy has that, but it's fine for us. It works the same, and it's okay to map this. So this is setting this db.integer, and here we're saying, okay, a string of 80 characters, make it unique, I guess a unique username, it can't be null, and then same thing, a unique email address, column type is string, unique is true, right, and then it cannot be null. All right, so this will set up our user model. And notice also we are passing through this db.model thing. I can talk about that more in a little bit. This involves inheritance. But this is kind of like the setup that you all will do. Is basically you'll have, for each column, you'll say what they map to, right? You'll have a class variable, and then you'll say, okay, well, this ID maps to a column, a SQL Alchemy column of type integer, etc. All right.
Oh, hi, Jen.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, yeah, could you go to the SQL file, like create table? Yeah, so do we need both? Like, do we need to run this SQL file, or we can just, I think by user.py, like
No,
those.
we have to run this SQL. We have to run a SQL file to create the table. There is like SQL Alchemy does have a library that can write these migrations for you. That can effectively
Right.
write this file for you. But all that will happen is it will write the file for you, and you still will need to run the file. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So this is going to actually create and insert the users in the database, and then the model will say this is declaring a class, right? A Python class that interacts with this table, right? And a table that has these columns. That's what this is doing. Yeah.
Does it enforce database constraints here, like primary key and unique?
Right, it will.
If
Yeah,
it,
so it will break. Oh man, why do I keep talking? So it will break on two levels. Like if you don't have, say you these are not unique, you'll get a SQL Alchemy error, and I believe you'll also probably before you get a Postgres error, you'll get a SQL Alchemy error, but you'd also get one um, here. Like for this one, you would also get it. See an email an error here. Okay. And so this will happen if you try to add a record that has an email that already exists. So SQL Alchemy will produce an error probably before even it gets to the database. All right. Uh, let's. So the next thing. So here's something that's pretty cool that you can do with SQL Alchemy, which is you get a console automatically. It's not going to work right now. You can see I have I call this line Flask shell, and what I'd love to do is then be able to interact with my user, but it says user is not defined. So this is the next thing we can do, right? So far what we did was we connected to our database through this, and then we set up a model that connects to a specific table. So the next thing we can do is actually interact with this thing. When we call something like Flask shell, what it looks for is this same server.py file, right? Because of this .flaskenv saying, hey, this is the main file we want to look at. So in this server.py, you can see what we can do is have a decorator. So we can use our app, and then we call this line, I can never remember, call it shell context processor. And then I'm going to say def, it can be called anything you want. I think make shell context is fine. Parentheses, and now we're going to return a dictionary, and really all we need is user. All right, so we'll say have a variable in the shell called user that points to the model where that model comes from app.models import user. Here we have from.user import user, and then this right is importing this here. Now let's try to do Flask shell, and now we have access to our user model. Okay. Not only do we have access to our user model, but we can do something like user.first. I am lying. User.query. There we go. User.query.first. Okay, so we can retrieve, and you can think about what this is calling underneath, right? This is really writing select all from users where ID equals 1, right? And you can see that this is writing that for us. And we can do something else like user.query all, right? And this is giving us all the users. Notice that this is printing out, right? It's in a little kind of a nice fashion, I suppose. This user John Doe. Why is that occurring? That's because in this is a Python. You can do this without SQL Alchemy. This is a Python thing where when you define a class, you can do this dunder repr thing, like how is this represented as? And here I'm saying it's represented as a string user, right? Followed by self.user.name, right? We can do hello world, whatever, and that would change it, right? You see that? So again, normally what you'll do, last times what you can do, this could be an F string if you want. Maybe that's a little bit better. You can do the self.username, and then we can put in like self.id or self.email, right? And we can just say like, this is the username, is that, and this is the email, is that. We can exit this out. All right, so here's the user, right? The username is John Doe. The email is this, right? However you prefer to see it is fine. All right, but lots of times you'll just have all the attributes there. Okay, so this is, like how we get set up with SQL Alchemy. All right, what we had to do, just to review, is this is our connection effectively object, right? This SQL Alchemy class, we're creating an instance of it. Then we just create our Flask app. And then here, it's a little indirect. We connect our Flask app. We set this attribute in the config to our connection string, right? This happens to be local. This could be like a database on AWS. You just get the string, and it will work fine as long as the database is public. And then we just here at this DB init app, right? We're passing through an app that has knowledge of our database and then returning it. And then server.py, this is calling create app. And we know that when we call something like flash shell or flask run, this .flaskm file is saying, okay, look at this server.py file for it. And then the last thing we did was just app shell context processor, make a shell context, and then specify, all right, this user variable really is this user model, okay? The thing that we did not talk about yet is this part, I suppose. What is this? db.model, each of these things, db.integer, db.model, these are classes, right? It's capital letter. This is a class. And what you can imagine is there's a class called model, right? And we have, let's say like we have a special init function there, and then we have, some other methods here, like maybe the query method, right? We saw that we could call it user.query, right? And that returns some sort of query object. Okay, so when we pass this thing through, db.model, what we're doing is we're saying inherit, okay? The user should inherit from this generic model. And this generic model has a function like called a query or called, first or whatever, has some functionality that we want all of our models to have, okay? And it will inherit these functions. So if there, if there is not, you can override it. Like if you wrote a function down here, also called query, it wouldn't see this other one. But by default, it will, if this thing does not exist, it will go find it here. I'm going to actually show this for real. So let's just return the number 1 here. We have a user. Let's just make this a normal class. And we'll comment this out. And now we'll say, okay, we have a class called model. We're going to have user inherit from it. And we don't need any of this. And we'll just write pass. All right. And now we'll do Python 3 -i app models user.py. Let's see if that works. Okay. So we have our user class. We can create a new user. Oopsies. But that's fine. And then let's do user.query. See that? How beautiful is that? So what happened is, right, it looks for the method query here on the original class, does not find it, and then says, okay, what about on the class it's inheriting from? It sees the method query, returns 1. If you write a function here called query, right, it will override it, obviously, right? So if I do, here's a user, then I do user.query. Now what happens? Looks for the method query here, finds it, stops, right? So that's what we're taking advantage. That's what SQL Alchemy is taking advantage of. Is okay, let's import db.model, and they have defined this class that has, certain built-in functions that now automatically, we get, right, just by inheriting from it. Okay? You all feel okay about this, or questions about this?
So the DB.model has all the data types and everything is defined, right? Integers, string, datetime.
We'll notice how we're implementing this, right? Like db.integer, this is actually a class on our db object as well, right? db.column, right? This is coming from there. db.column, right? This is coming from there. But for example, like one thing we get for free, let's call Flask shell, right? Is I can now do user name equals, Bob. Oh man. Oh no, it's not user. See, it broke. That was actually good, right? Because name is an invalid keyword argument for user. Let's do username. And that works. So how does that work for free? Like, how did that automatically work? Well, look, it calls this init function, and that's getting called in, I guess, this deep in the from the SQL Alchemy library, right? So how is this getting called? Because we're inheriting. When I do user and pass through, this keyword argument, if it's going to actually be going to this db.model, right? And db.model has an init function that is getting triggered, right? Our code does not have an init function, but db.model does, and it will look at these class variables to see, all right, is this keyword argument, does it match the columns that you're specifying? So it's like that kind of, right, functionality that is providing for us. Could you show server.py again? Sure. So all that's happening here is we're calling our create app function, and then we're making our shell context processor. Lots of times people also will provide, like in the documentation, it says, okay, also provide a link to this connection object. So we can do that too. All right. In that way, we can access DB as well. Right, and you can see this is our connection.
So what did the shell, it made it so the user class and now the DB object are available to the Flask shell?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And how do we access the Flask shell? That's what I was like.
Oh, yeah, you just type in this Flask shell. So if you type in...
So that's something that like you'd want to do in a server?
I do it a lot, yeah, because, one, it's kind of like our normal console, right? It's easy to then interact, test our methods as you write a method, add a method to the user class. Okay, let's open up the Flask shell, make sure this thing works, query some data. Or if this is connected to some, like your actual database, yeah, you can just perform some, this is like writing SQL queries, right? user.query.all.
But it's more focused on like the development process, right? Okay.
I think so, yeah. Right, yeah. It's more on your development process. Because ultimately you'll probably write a script, right? Like it's like you can see how it works. Okay, this looks pretty good. Now let's, you can write a Python script to find all the users or whatever. But yeah, I use this, like the shell, all the time, just to interact and test out my queries before implementing them. One last thing, you can do this, I might get it wrong. I think it's this filter by method. Let's say username equals John Doe dot all. You see that? It's pretty nice. So what this is saying, where you can imagine like what is occurring under the hood. User.query.filter by username equals John Doe. What this is doing is really saying select all from users from this class where the username equals this, right? Like this is why we really delay teaching SQL Alchemy, if at all, is because I want you all to really have in mind, right, the actual SQL underneath. All right. But you can see this is calling that. One other thing to note is until you specify if you want all or one, it is not running the SQL query, right? It is returning like a query object. And then it's only when you have like this final method of, hey, give me all the users. Hey, give me just the first user, right? That's when it's executing the query. So it's just important to pay attention to that a little bit too. All right. Okay. That's all I think I wanted to cover. Other questions? So in terms of